take refuge in the one bright mind. I take refuge in the wisdom of all the Buddhas. And I take refuge in the warmth and compassion of the Sangha. So we're continuing on with the talks by about the Mumonkan, the Gateless Gate, the classic collection of of koans. It's been used for 1,000 years in helping people to see the nature of reality. So we're working this evening on case number 24, and it's got various translations for the title. Shibayama Roshi says, abandon words and speaking. Eiken Roshi says, equality and differentiation. Yamada Roshi says, leaving speech and silence behind. And Gyogu, who's a Chinese teacher, says, apart from words. And in a way, the very, while all of the titles have to do with words, the koan really isn't about words. But let me go ahead and read the koan here. And the Japanese, Shibayama Roshi is a Japanese teacher, so he uses the Japanese pronunciation, and then some teachers use the Chinese pronunciation, and it becomes very confusing trying to figure out who people are sometimes. But I'll use the Japanese pronunciation here. The koan. A monk once asked Master Fuketsu, both speaking and silence are concerned with re-by relativity. How can we be free and non-transgressing? Fuketsu said, how fondly I remember Konan in March. The partridges are coming, the flowers are fragrant. Actually, let me give you a different translation. The monk asked Master Fuketsu and said, speech and silence are both concerned with equality and differentiation. How can I transcend equality and differentiation? And then Fuketsu quotes the poem. He says, how fondly I remember Konan in March. The partridges are calling, the flowers are fragrant. I think it's a better, more accessible translation. So he translates equality and differentiation. And then the commentary, because each of the koans in the Mumonkan has got a koan, a commentary about Master Mumon, and then a short poem. So the commentary says, Fuketsu's Zen works like lightning. He has his way and marches along. But why does he rely upon the tongue of an ancient poet and does not get rid of it? Why is he quoting somebody else, essentially? If you can clearly see into this point, you may attain absolute freedom. Abandon words and speaking and say a word. Mumon's poem. He used no high-flown words. Before the mouth is opened, it is revealed. If you keep on chattering glibly, you will never get to know it. So this is a teacher in the Rinzai line of Zen, and Master Rinzai was in the 800s. And this particular teacher, Master Fuketsu, was like the third or fourth generation after Master Rinzai. And so you can, Rinzai was apparently very charismatic, very strong, very moving teacher. And as always, almost always, after there's a really powerful, charismatic person in charge, the next generation, you know, Shakespeare's children probably didn't write Shakespearean plays. Or, you know, George Washington's progeny probably weren't up to George Washington. It's a very classic kind of thing. It's a regression to the mean. It's what happens. We all tend to become more and more ordinary. So Rinzai was in northern China. He died in 866. And during that time, there were rebellions, there were Mongols who were coming in, there were persecutions that had been going on. It was the falling apart of the Tang Dynasty. So Rinzai was in this period, and he died in CE, or he died when he was about 54 years old. So his followers had a really tough time. His followers were not, they inherited something valuable, but nobody recognized them. Nobody particularly said, oh, Rinzai's students, oh, how great. Nobody came flocking to them. They were probably living in small temples or living in some place in a city, opened up a little practice place, opened up a center, perhaps inherited a temple, and perhaps had very few disciples. So their job was to really keep practice alive, even though there wasn't a whole lot of recognition or support, or nobody saying, well, here, we think you're great, we'll give you money or time or whatever. And I think that's the case with all of us, is that we have the good fortune temporarily of having a nice community, of having buildings and grounds, having a place like the monastery, but then we leave. And then we go off and we're on our own. Or I leave and everybody else, my disciples, are on their own. And it's up to us to keep our practice going. It's up to us to keep investigating the nature of mind, because the truth does not come or go. The truth is always present. And so each person who comes along hopefully is inspired enough to has confidence enough in looking at the basic nature of truth, the basic nature of mind. People who are known, the only advantage is sometimes people will listen with a little less resistance. They may have a certain credibility, but you can get elected with strong charisma and a certain kind of credibility. That doesn't really mean anything. So the only and if you are recognized, if there is a lot of people who are interested in what you're teaching, and a lot of people hear it, like the Dalai Lama, then nobody can get close to you. You lose the personal connection. So all these teachers that came, they weren't these great, magnificent teachers with thousands of monks that were recognized, that were part of a big network. They were probably some small little guy or woman sitting in a temple somewhere, and perhaps in their lifetime, things grew. Perhaps as they matured, people came around. But they may have only had one or two disciples. And I think that a few generations after Master Rinzai, after Master Linji died, I think there was only one person who actually was his Dharma heir alive in the world at one point. So here's this guy who's practicing, and somebody comes up with a kind of theoretical sort of question, a little heady. He's asking about absolute and relative truth. Okay? Now, so absolute and relative truth, it means the absolute truth is what is present at all times. What is present, what is always recognizable, what is the fundamental true nature, Rigpa, Kunshi, Dharmakaya, the nature of God, what is true at all places and all times. All things come from the one. And the relative is all of us, all of the individual, dividing in parts and pieces. So for example, the hand is one hand, the body is one body, but in that one body there are lots of parts. So the fingers are the relative, and the whole body is the oneness of things. So this monk is asking about paradox. He's saying, here I am in this body, here I am in this world where I get sick, where there are rebellions, where there is all sorts of government problems, where I'm having to struggle hard to earn a living, where there are social problems, where I have my personal challenges, all the relative stuff that we all know so well. He's saying, given all of this, given how bad my life seems sometimes, and given how sick I can be, given how crazy everything looks, how can we find freedom in the midst of all these problems? if we boil this whole complicated koan down, we can say it's about how do we find freedom? How do we transcend the words which divide and always are dividing and separating? I mean, that's the reason. That's the nature of words. If we say this is a pencil, then we're also saying it's not a spoon. It's not the Tower of Babel. So the words differentiate things from one another. So he's saying, in the world of differentiation, how do I find freedom? In the world filled with problems, how do I find freedom? How do I find liberation from suffering? So the koan, it sounds sort of esoteric. It sounds kind of a little strange. How do we abandon words and speaking, and how do we go beyond relative and absolute? But it really is about our own challenge, our own friction. So that is the koan. How do I, with all of my defects, my inadequacies, my brokenness, my sickness, my aging, find freedom? And that's a genuine koan that we all have. How do I find wholeness in the midst of separation? Now, we all begin practicing, as you all know so well, by trying to get rid of things. We come, we hear about Zazen, and we say, okay, I want to practice, I want to find equanimity so I can get rid of the anxiety, I want to find presence so I can get rid of the turmoil of my thinking. And that's a very reasonable way of starting to practice. Say, okay, I would like to boil down all the problems in my life down to their root cause, and then have some wisdom that comes from that. But when we first start practicing, we don't know root causes. We don't really know what those are. So we're running as fast as we can, trying as hard as we can to either get something that's going to give us some peace, or get rid of something that we hope, if I just get rid of these thoughts, if I just get rid of this sensation in my body, if I just had more money, if I just had a different or a better or another or a partner, then I'll find some freedom. I'll find some liberation. And so, of course, as we all know, we live our lives in quiet desperation. Quiet desperation. So there are some clear steps that we all can take. Clear steps. The first step is we do our best to live in accord with the precepts. As soon as someone does their best to live in accord with the precepts, their suffering diminishes. Not to kill, but to cherish all life. Not to steal, but to respect the things of others. Not to lie, but to speak the truth. Not to misuse drugs and alcohol, but to keep the mind clear. Not to misuse sexual energy, but to live a life of honesty and integrity. And then it goes on into criticism and judgment and generosity and anger. So we come, and the first place anybody who wants to reduce suffering starts is with precepts. Living a life of integrity. And it has nothing to do with Buddhism. It has nothing to do with even the spiritual life. It just has to do, when we're living in accord with the precepts, then we are actually living much more in accord with the way things are. We're living much more in accord, and so a lot of the friction begins to stop. Then the second level is when we're not coming in filled with anxiety about things that we've done, we can begin to actually pay attention to what is. We can pay attention to the direct sensation of, how do my hands feel? How does my breath feel? What do my legs feel? And we can begin to become present. And what we want to become present with is direct experience, not our ideas or memory about direct experience. So again, memory is that we all have houses. We remember that. That's in the past. It's something that we have brought up. Now, it may be that our house is burning down and we don't even know it. It may be that this expectation that we have based on our memory is not true. So the next level is to stop looking at all of our expectations, but to look at what is. The direct, vivid experience of having hands, breath, body, sensation. And then we begin looking at what are these sensations without the story. So I have a feeling in my chest or my back, and it's pressure, it's tension, it is tight, and that's it. It's pressure, it's tension, it's tight. It may be uncomfortable, but I don't have to add a whole story on it happened because, when I was Cleopatra in a past life, someone stuck a sword through my... It's just the sensation. We're sitting right here in this room. We have the sound that we're hearing. We feel our bodies on the cushions. We see what sights we see. And we can begin to let go of all of our fixed beliefs, the narrow views, the conclusions that we've drawn about ourselves and the world. So we have a conclusion that somehow I'm inadequate or I'm a failure. But that's based upon past. It's based upon memory. It's based upon some judgment. It's based upon some picture. It's based upon some ideal. The reality is that all of us are equally sitting here, whole, complete. The direct sensory experience, everyone is here, right now. Learning to pay attention to what is rather than what we think is, learning to pay attention to what is rather than the stories about it, is the next place of practice. And so we come here, ideally we do zazen, or you sit at home, someplace or other, you calm down and say, let me get really grounded right here. What do my feet feel like? What do my hands feel like? What does my breath feel like? And we feel it. And then we apply curiosity to that direct experience. We have curiosity. And so when we have curiosity, it brings us in closer. We begin to feel and investigate it more deeply. We're sitting with a tub of water and we get curious how warm it is. Well, the scientific mind could stick a thermometer in there and measure the temperature. But the practice way is you put your hand in. And then with your own direct experience, you get a sense of, well, how warm or cold is this in my life? So we have these thoughts, these stories. This is the best of times. This is the worst of times. This is a time like no other. This is the end times. This is the destruction of the earth. And those are all stories. We can ask, is this true? Is it really true this is the worst time that there's ever been? And anybody who's read any of history knows that we are living in a place of great peace right now. Or anybody who's looked even further back in history realizes that there were meteors and volcanoes, and there were dark ages where the sky was covered with dust for eons. Nothing would grow. It was cold. Perhaps there are some good things and some bad things going on right now, and it's just an ordinary time. Perhaps human beings are just as greedy and generous and kind as they always have been. Perhaps we are in the adolescence of our evolution, that we have just teenagers who've been thrashing our room, trashing our room, and now we're beginning to grow up and say, well, it's time to clean it up again. Perhaps it's simply part of the growing up of the human culture and not the worst of times. Perhaps scientists say that, oh yeah, that we are doomed, that the ecology has, the environment has degenerated to such a point that we are not going to be able to survive. But science also says that our entire world is fabricated from our own consciousness. So if we look at our direct sensory input, we feel something with our hands. By the time we recognize the feeling of what happened with our hands, it's already over. It's a memory. We don't feel things in real time because it takes time, even though it may take nanoseconds, to go from the sensation of the hand up through the spinal cord to the brain, to be processed to the brain, to be recognized. It takes time. So by the time we recognize something, it's already gone. What we think of as so real has actually already passed. And at one level, what people are now saying is the brain is taking all of the sensory input and predicting what's going to happen next, that our whole life is a prediction. Oh yeah, based upon the patterning that I have learned as a child, I'm going to predict what's going to happen next. And so we're actually never in the present, because the sensory experience is always in the past, we recognize it, and our prediction of what's going to happen is always in the future, and so there's this sense of unreality about our life. It may be that what we think of as real is simply the brain churning. It may be that the path that we walk is being created each time we take a step, and that our intention each time we take a step turns the path one way or the other. So at this level, we have to look directly and more intimately. What is it that's aware? What is it that's aware? And we begin to see more and more closely that awareness is aware, and that the objects of awareness are already happened in a way. The only stable thing is awareness. That there is no future, there's just awareness, there's just this moment. And all this is the dreamlike nature of reality. And even what we call awareness is simply the dreamlike nature of awareness. And then we get into the reality of the moving, ever-present dream. So, aside from all that, this guy comes and says, I'm suffering. How do I find transcendence? Now, when you've got differentiation and sameness, when you've got two different things, you can't actually make them one thing. You know, you've got a left hand and a right hand. Well, as long as you have a right hand and a left hand, they're two different things. And no matter how close you put them together, there's still a left and a right hand. So, the only way to do that, to see the oneness of things like this, where you have two hands, is to look at the root of awareness itself. That awareness itself, before the mind says left, right, left, right, left, right, before the mind is already chopping things up into two, before the verbiage of differentiation comes into place, there is the direct, vivid experience of awareness, whole and complete, with no division. Now, his particular question about words and silence is saying there are all the words, that are all this endless stream of words that's coming out right now. The mind recognizes all these patterns of sound and then puts the patterns of sound together in little packages and interprets each of those little packages as particular words and those words as sentences and those sentences as paragraph, and we have some vague idea that perhaps we are communicating. That I have some vague idea that perhaps you're hearing what I'm saying and thinking what I'm saying, and perhaps it works the other way around. We don't know. So, how can we bring together oneness and two-ness? How can we bring together speech and silence? How can we bring together suffering and freedom from suffering? Because we can't deny either. We can't deny the difficulties that we have. How do we find freedom in the midst of our own difficulties? That's really what this koan is about. Every time I think of this koan, I think of the myth of Sisyphus. You know, Sisyphus was originally a Greek myth where Sisyphus was very arrogant and greedy and killed lots of people and got into trouble with Zeus. And one of the parts of that myth was he managed to chain death. He chained Thanos, and because Thanos couldn't get to him, he couldn't die. So Zeus had to find a way of punishing Sisyphus, who wasn't going to die. And so his punishment was he would be pushing a rock up the hill, up the mountain, endlessly. And as soon as he get to the top, it would roll back down, and he had to push it back up again and roll back down and push it up again endlessly because he couldn't die. So how does Sisyphus find freedom? How do we find freedom in the midst of going to work every day, in the midst of fighting traffic, in the midst of paying bills, in the midst of getting sick? How do we find freedom? Now, Albert Camus took that particular story and wrote a very lovely little book on there called The Myth of Sisyphus. And his conclusion is basically the same as with Zen, with reality, is that by total, complete engagement, by body, mind, and consciousness, by total presence, by total activity, by being right where we are, completely engaged, with no evaluation, with no judgment, just totally engaged, like Sisyphus, straining with all of his might to push that rock up the hill. For us, being completely present, straining with all our might to be exactly where we are, straining with all our might to be completely engaged in our life, straining with all our might. And how much strain does it take to be where you are? How much strain does it take to be yourself? There's another koan that says difficult, difficult. And somebody else says, easy, easy. And somebody else says, well, it's neither difficult nor easy. It's about being ourselves. Very difficult, very difficult. Most natural thing in the world. So the way it is. So let's tie it all together. So we do Zazen, and Zazen is about coming back to the direct, vivid experience of being in your own body and your own place at this time. And so when we're in the middle of challenge, when we're in the middle of suffering, when we're sick, when we're old, when we have problems, to completely say there's something right here in this instant to be learned. There's something right here with this particular culmination of my entire history, this particular culmination of all of karma. There's something right here, right in the very gist of the experience that is vital, that is important, that reveals itself. And so Fuketsu says, well, how do you transcend speech and silence? And he quotes a poem. The winter evening settles down like smell of, forgot it. Or, if you want to tame the beast within, first see it as beautiful. Or, geographical therapy never works because you always take yourself with you. It is not so much in those words, it is the speaking, the experience, the vital expression in that moment. And that's the lessons from this particular koan for our life. How do we live our life fully? Not complaining and moaning and groaning, but live it fully. But see what lessons there are to learn by learning exactly what's being taught to us. So, this koan is very intimate, very practical one. May everyone gain the wisdom and the depth of being that our life is asking us to realize right here, right now.